Hello. Today we're at the Gemeente Museum in The Hague with Gerrit de Rook, who is going to tell us something about the collection here. Now, this building, which is interesting in itself, it's the last building that was designed by famous Dutch architect Berlage, has been renovated. So they also have a very extensive collection of paintings. So we're going to talk with Gerrit right now. Could you tell me, first of all, a little about the building itself?
The building has been opened in 1935. People started building in 1929, so it took 6 years to build it. And Berlage died a year before the opening in 1934. It was, as you said, his last building, and it was one of the few buildings in that period which was designed as a museum itself. And the architect tried to achieve two things as his main objectives were to use daylight as much as possible. And second, to avoid museum fatigue, because that was a very important work in the 30s, museum fatigue, and that should be avoided. So to avoid it, he made a lot of smaller rooms in this museum, not huge rooms with endless rows of paintings, but smaller rooms to create a kind of intimacy with the work of art.
Recently, you've undertaken some renovations here. Could you tell me a little about that?
Well, the building was 60 years old and never had been. Had been damaged a lot during the war period. It was empty for 2 years, so no glass was whole more after that period. So in the post-war period, with cheap means, it had to be reinstalled. Well, it started leaking, to be honest. So we had to do a number of things to avoid that, because that's not so nice to have things like that in a museum. And also the walls on the outside were not becoming better. So a huge restoration was started. It was one of the earliest restorations of what we call in Holland a young monument. It did cost a lot of money, more than 50 million guilders. It took nearly 3 years to do a project like that. The museum had been closed for nearly 2 years, but we are now like new.
Speaking of new, you have quite an extensive collection and various categories. Could you tell me a little about the overall collection of the museum itself?
Yeah, we have 4 collections in this museum. One of the collections is the modern art department, where we focus on the period 1860-1960. But we also have older works and newer works as well. We have a huge collection of applied arts, mainly furniture, silver, glass, porcelain, ceramics. We have a collection of musical instruments, both Western and non-Western, and also there a new addition, the electronical musical instruments, the new instruments. And we are very proud that since the reopening of this museum, we have a fashion gallery. Because we have a huge fashion department, but fashion is very difficult to expose. So for exhibits like that, you need a space where there's no daylight. And we have created a space like that in the old museum, in a kind of cell under the inner courtyard of the museum. A completely new space. We are very proud, ideal for fashion.
Today we're sitting in the painting collection. In fact, we're sitting in front of one of the early Mondrians. Would you tell us something about a general overview of your painting collection? Who is included and what kind of work?
Our main themes are Impressionism, French Impressionism. We have Van Gogh, we have Monet. The Hague School, a Dutch translation more or less of the school of Barbizon of France, where painters started going outside and paint real nature for the first time, more or less. Before that it was idealized nature. We have the early symbolism introduced in the Netherlands by works like Redon, for example, Torop. Then we have a huge collection of German expressionism. And then Mondrian is really, there is no place in the world where you can see Mondrian as good as here. We always will have 40 till 60 paintings where you can see the whole, the way he worked through his themes, how he started his middle period, his Cubist period and his later period. We have a huge collection of works by Constant, one of the Cobra artists, who not only made Cobra works, but also in the 60s made a kind of city for, what he called the city for the Homo Ludens, a new Babylon. And he made a kind of maquettes for that, which are really very interesting and very intriguing. And we have the more recent works of art, let's say Karel Visser or J.C.J. van der Heijden, Dutch artists who already worked for a rather long time and are more vested in Dutch art history.
Recently, you've been the recipient of a very expensive painting. I know that money shouldn't be a criterion for judging a work of art, and that's true. But could you tell me a little about the story of your recent acquisition?
Yeah, well, it was a gift of the, as you know, in Europe, there won't be national currencies in a few years, 2002, and the Dutch bank wanted to commemorate the fact that they guarded the guilder for so many years and so many centuries. So they wanted to make a gift in commemoration of that to the Dutch state, and they gave a huge sum of money, 110 million guilders, to a foundation. And the first thing the foundation did was to buy a huge, important work of art, which especially people who like modern art already wanted to have in Holland for a rather long time. I mean, it's the 7th or 8th effort to get to try this work from the States to Holland again. And that's the last work, the last unfinished work, Victory Boogie Woogie by Piet Mondrian. And we are very happy that they bought that work for 80 million guilders, $40 million from an American person, private person, and gave it to the state of the Netherlands with the condition that it should be exhibited permanently in this museum. And well, we are very happy that this crown on our Mondrian collection could be added, because especially the later period of Mondrian in our collection, especially the American period of Mondrian, was not represented in our collection, and we have now the top work.
Speaking of Mondrian, now he struggled a great deal here in Holland, never really achieved fame early on, even though some of his contemporaries like Slouters and Kestel were more accepted. Could you tell us a little about Mondrian's sojourn through the years?
Well, Mondrian bloomed late in his life. He was 40 when he found his real style. He was then in Paris. That's a reason also that the connection with Holland was diminished a bit, because an artist who permanently stayed in France wasn't Dutch, I think they thought in that time. But then he invented his neoplasticism and made the Mondrians we all know, with the squares in primary colors more or less, and the lines, black lines, vertical and horizontal. But there was a long way to get there. It was not an easy way. And we have Mondrians from 1895, so let's say the 25 years before that, how he struggled, how he found his way from landscape painting in the tradition of the Hague School to experimenting with color under influence of Van Gogh, as we say in Dutch, and the Fauves, for example, the painters who started to introduce harsher colors in France around 1907. You see all these influences worked in the same theme by Mondrian. So you see the landscape change, as you, well, not on the painting behind us, but on the other paintings in this room, you see a kind of abstraction coming into the painting, an abstraction of the forms and the colors to come to something more definite. What Mondrian always wanted to achieve is to find an equilibrium in his paintings, but to find that, he had to see through the nature, as he called it himself. He wanted to see the eternal harmony, or the eternal forms, or the eternal structure which was behind all the changing visual movements which we have in our view, which make it difficult for us to see that. So therefore he painted a lot by night, at night, because then all these small individual things, moving things, disappeared, and the greater structure was visible for him. Form came first, then came color, and then in 1911 came Cubism, a mix of color and form, because the color was brownish, greenish, and the idea of looking was also completely different. He worked through that phase, came back in the First World War in Holland. He had to come here because his father was ill, and he had to stay here because the Great War broke out. And then the sea came in his at help, the sea and the stars. So from trees, landscape, huge things like sea and stars helped him to find his road and to come to the abstraction of the works in the 1920s and later.
Another part of your collection that you mentioned is an extensive collection of German Expressionist paintings. These are sometimes some I really like. Can you tell me how those came about and who you have represented here?
We have two beautiful paintings by Kandinsky, which are not ours. They are in some way we exchanged them with the Guggenheim Museum, who has two of our Mondrians on a longer base. They already have them for 30 years or something like that, and we have two of their Kandinskys, so more or less on a very long-term basis. We have very beautiful works by Kirchner, Schmid-Rottluff, all the great people from Die Brücke. We have a few works by Campendonck, who was a German artist who taught in Amsterdam. And for example, Jawlensky, we have beautiful works. We also have some beautiful sculptures by German artists like Barlach and Leenbroek, which we show now and then in our collection.
I'd like to talk a little about now your applied art collection. Could you tell me what you have represented there and give me a little description?
Very important is our glass collection, which goes from the very earliest period till the present day. So it goes from the let's say Muslim countries, the Mideast countries, which was very important for the glass production. We have new rooms for that as well, surrounding the fashion gallery. And then we have the glass, let's say, from the Dutch early German and Dutch early glass from the Middle Ages, going to the refined Venetian glass, which came up in the Renaissance period, till the experimenting with glass, which happened in Holland in the later years, like by people like Borek Sipek or Bert Vrijns.
And you have furniture in this collection too, huh?
To show furniture is always a bit difficult. I mean, what are you doing with a chair or what are you doing with a table? So we have one temporary room where we show furniture, and we have 6 period rooms. And a period room is very nice to show furniture because you can show it in the context of the room, of the complete room. So that's a nice method to show things like that.
So overall, your collection is on how many floors and rooms? And I see you have an extensive map.
Well, in fact, we had 2 floors. We have now 3 with the fashion gallery under the ground floor, under the first floor. We have a lot of rooms. So in this museum, there are nearly 100 rooms and bigger spaces where we show the works of art. The advantage of that is that's never crowded. There are never too many people. Even when we have thousands of people, they disperse throughout the museum. The only disadvantage of that is perhaps that it's difficult to find your way back to the exit or the entrance or to the toilet or where you want to go. So it's a bit labyrinthic, but we have to take that disadvantage but the intimacy, the intimate contact with the works of art is very important and very huge here and very, very well possible.
So if the people want to come and visit your museum, what are your hours and when are you open?
We are open from Tuesday through to Sunday from 1100 till 1700 hours, as we say in Dutch, so 11 a.m. till 5 p.m., but not on Monday.
Okay, well, thank you very much for telling us about your collection.
Okay, you're welcome.
Hello, this is David Heine, Aspect Art. Thank you for joining us. Today we're in Utrecht at the Museum Catharina Convent for a new show called Life After Death. With us today is the curator, Helen Roostevelt, who's going to tell us about all the special manners that people not only regarded life after death, but also what they did to get themselves out of purgatory and into heaven, or to avoid going to hell. So join us now in Utrecht at the Catharina Convent for Life After Death.
The exhibition shows how people tried to be memorized after death, and in order that their family and other relatives would pray for their souls after death, in the hope that their souls would be in purgatory as shortly as possible. And by many prayers you could shorten the period in purgatory. Only saints would go to heaven immediately after death. The normal human beings would have sins on their souls, so they would have to be burned in purgatory for a certain period. And by making all kinds of arrangements during your life, like going on a pilgrimage or by an indulgency from the church, you could get a shortening of your punishment in purgatory, but prayers were one of the most important parts of the memorial services and for getting a shorter punishment in purgatory.
Now, a lot of the depictions are paintings and memorials that are made for these people. What were some of the ways that these people could prepare themselves for getting out of purgatory?
By, for instance, giving alms to the poor, or giving them bread and food. The acts of mercy, the 7 works of mercy, were quite important. One of the important preparations for dying, was to receive the last sacraments. If you had not received the last sacraments before your death, you could not go to heaven. And our exhibition, I think, shows quite beautifully what preparations one made for death, but also how a medieval funeral was prepared, and how people would sing during Mass, what kind of cloths were worn during these memorial services. And you see people in very beautiful illuminated manuscript, people on their deathbed, and who would take care of them, what would happen to their soul. You see angels taking the souls out of, when they were departed from the body, to heaven. You see souls in heaven, but you see many souls in purgatory. And in fact, purgatory and hell, especially hell, is quite fascinating to illustrate. We cannot really illustrate heaven. It's so beautiful that human beings cannot really paint it. But what happens in hell with all the devils taking the souls into fires is quite astonishing how that was depicted during the Middle Ages.
Now, they had an idea about life on Earth, and it was oftentimes mitigated by the shortness of life in those days. What did a rich person do as far as creating these memorials? What was inherent in the memorials that were painted for them?
First of all, you see, and that is most important, a religious scene in the middle of the painting. And next to this religious scene, you see the persons depicted in an attitude of prayer. So the donors of the painting are painted in prayer. And on these paintings, they are identified by coats of arms, and sometimes by inscriptions mentioning their names, and also inscriptions asking the public to pray for their souls. So I think there are not many exhibitions on medieval culture where you see so many medieval people depicted. You may think it's an exhibition on death, but you never see so many medieval persons depicted as you can see in our exhibition.
Now, included in this beautiful exhibition is a lot of illuminated manuscripts. Could you talk about those a little for us?
We have an extraordinary collection gathered throughout the world, from the Vatican to New York to several other libraries in the world, of books of hours, illuminated books of hours. And in these books of hours you find all kinds of prayers, also prayers to be said during the night. You would guard next to the deceased and you would pray certain prayers. And these prayers are illustrated with a number of scenes of the medieval funeral. So you can see a dying man or woman on her deathbed with clerics around it, family surrounding in prayer. But you can also see how the coffin is brought to the church, how the coffin is brought to the cemetery. You see several cemeteries depicted, and all kinds of acts that would be done before the body was trusted to the ground. And that is, I think, nowhere so well depicted as in these miniatures in medieval books. It's like a storybook, not in one single manuscript, but throughout a collection of manuscripts.
I have a very special one, which is related to a family in Haarlem, in which you know a lot about the history of it. Could you tell us a little about that book? It's
a unique book. It's unique that it survived because it's such a large volume. It's a choir book, so it was used at a lectern in the church, and several people could sing of it. It's so big that the notes are easily to be read by several people. And this book is so special because we know so much of its history. We know when it was written, we know who it wrote, we know who illuminated it, and we know who presented the book to the monastery in Haarlem. And the people who bought this book, who paid the costs for making this book, because it was a very expensive book, are depicted in the margins. And there is not one other book preserved from our country that shows so many families. And you see a man, a husband and wife with several children commemorated in the margins of this manuscript. And that makes it so unique. It's such a personal book. It's a personal story of certain families in Haarlem at the end of the 15th century.
Now, you've included in your exhibition a lot of paintings of the aristocracy of that period of time, who were wealthy enough to have themselves depicted with saints and St. John and so on. There is also one whose husbands became the stadtholder, or one of her husbands became the stadtholder. Could you tell us a little about her life and why she was important and is depicted here?
We are talking about Elisabeth van Culemborg, Vrouwe van Culemborg in Hoogstraten. And she took care a lot of the government of her estates, while her husbands, she married twice and she survived both husbands, had important administrative functions at the court. So she was an independent woman and was also a very rich woman, and she made several arrangements for the memorial service of her soul and that of both her deceased husbands. She built a church in Culemborg. She built also an orphanage in her name and in her husband's name. And with all these preparations, all these good works for her citizens, she tried to have her soul clear of sins after her death. And several documents still exist. The exhibition is also introduced by video commemorating her arrangements, and that is quite well illustrated because not only the churches that she built are still extant, but also several memorial paintings and documents concerning those memorial paintings are present. And there's not only in our exhibition, but also still in Culemborg and Hoogstraten, where the people still pray for her. And that is one of the important things, of course. These memorial services were intended for eternity. And we know, of course, that the Catholic Church was not allowed public service anymore after the Reformation. But for this lady in Culemborg, we know that still today memorial services are prayed for during Mass each Sunday in Culemborg. So she's one of the few examples that really succeeded in having memorial services until eternity, until now at least.
In your exhibition, you've included not only the memorials and the books, but you've included other medieval items. Could you tell us some about that?
Works that you could also do was to enrich the decoration of the church, and that could also include the vestments of the priests. So you could offer or present to the church beautiful chasubles with embroideries, and there you could also add personal momentum, your coat of arms, with an inscription for calling for prayers. And the same is for golden and silver chalices, in which you would add an inscription with a prayer, a call for prayer for your soul. And these objects would be used every day in Mass, or if it was of a very, very beautiful quality, like these chasubles, on special days.
You know, I'd like to make a little digression here from the exhibit itself. It's a wonderful exhibit, but let's talk a little about the museum itself. Could you tell us a little about what the mission of this museum is and what some of your collection is about?
Our museum was founded now about 20 years ago to show to the Dutch public part of our history, which is the history of the Christian culture in the Netherlands. That started about the 8th century with Willibrord, a missionary, but we continue to explain what happens in Christian life, Christian culture today. So our museum shows the history of Christian culture in the Netherlands from the 8th century until the 20th century, or the 21st century, indeed. The museum is founded 20 years ago, but it has collections of several older religious musea. And these were founded in the last century, where priests and chaplains and bishops traveled throughout the country to collect objects, religious objects that were not considered valuable anymore and that were at risk of being lost. And one of the best aspects of this museum is, of course, the older part of the collection, which is from the Middle Ages, by the time that the church was the most important donor or institution that gave assignments to artists to make objects. And the best quality of our collection are, of course, the sculptures, the Dutch sculptures. I think there's hardly any museum in the Netherlands where you can see so many beautiful 15th and 16th century wooden sculptures. And another part, which I think is one of the best in Western Europe, is the collection of medieval paraments or medieval embroideries. I think are unsurpassed in any other museum in Western Europe.
We're in Roelofs of Amsterdam, dealer in old masters. With us today is Carlo van Oosterhout. Carlo, tell me something about dealing in old masters. Are there a lot of them still available?
No, not a lot. Estimations have been made in the past, and we think that's maybe 1% of what has been made is still left, and still only a small part of this is on the market. So not really that much, and especially of good quality, no, not that much really, no.
Now, you told me that you feel your shop actually has some of the finest quality available. Do you primarily deal in Dutch painters?
Primarily in Dutch painters, yes, that's correct. Some of them, painters are French, some of them German, but mostly Dutch, yes, that's right, 17th century, yes.
Why was the Dutch 17th century old masters so important in the world of art?
Well, something quite unique happened in the 17th century. Of course, Holland became a free country. With a lot of free trade going on, a lot of money became available, and all of a sudden something exploded somehow. It's really something very, very mysterious, but all of a sudden in a lot of Dutch cities, painters of good quality emerged and really started making impressive paintings, really became famous worldwide rather quickly. And now, yes, we have some of them left still.
Now, who are some of the painters that you have represented here?
Well, we have a painter, for instance, Nicolaas Maas, who was a pupil of Rembrandt. And we have a beautiful still life of him. It's the only still life he probably has ever made. Other example, Albert Cuyp, a very important Dutch master of the 17th century. His first painting, probably, well, his first known painting, dated and signed. Beautiful still life by Jan van Meulen. It's not very much known of him, but he's a painter of superb quality. Only a few examples.
Now, we recently did a show at the Rijksmuseum of Still Lives, which is a wonderful show of still lives gathered from all around the world. The subject matter seemed oftentimes to be everyday life in Holland. Is this what you find?
That's true, that's correct. Everyday life, but with a religious overtone.
You can see that it's like today. Showcases with all kinds of objects that you can see when you come in the shop and you could buy out of stock. These things were not known. People that are looking to silver and that are working with silver, like I do, never think out of this angle. So I thought, well, this is a very interesting way because it will give you clues why certain objects look like they do. And what we found out, I worked with another guy together, he went into the archives. What we found out was that often shops possessed the models, for example, for little cast elements of the objects, like feet or notices, rims. It means that you can find these forms in objects of different silversmiths because these models were owned by the shopkeeper. So then you understand that the role of the silversmith is a little bit different from what you thought before. And now I'm talking about the huge amount of silversmith. Then you had a small group that considered themselves already in the 17th century as being artists, sculptors, namely Lutma. And doing this research in the archives to understand how it worked with these shops, we dived into the archives of the guild, the organization of the crafts. And in the middle of the 17th century, Lutma Jr., who had this shop with atelier with his father, he made a manifest with the two other leading guys of the guild. There were always three leading silversmiths who were organizing the guild, and Lutma Jr. was one of them. They made a manifest in which they wrote that it wasn't just that silver was valued only on its weight, and that the artistic invention wasn't calculated in it. And he considered himself as an artist, and he was talking about the inventors and the huge amount of followers who were following these inventions of this small group of leading silversmith artists. So if you're looking at the idea of these shops and what you could buy there, small objects, bigger objects that were bought out of stock, and on the other hand, the artists, sculptors, silversmiths who were only working in order for certain people, then you get a different view on the field. And that's what I tried to do writing this book, making this exhibition.
Amsterdam was a very significant, and remains a very significant gold and silver town, if you will. Mm-hmm. Why is this true?
You say it's still an important silver city? I think probably that's not true, because the role of silver is not at all what it used to be. Silver trade also was a sort of private banking. You could have your money transformed into objects, and the reason in the past, and the reason that silver objects have hallmarks, is only the guarantee that your silver object has the value of money of the day you have it, you want to change it. So a coin had its value in weight, silver in weight. The working on silver was very cheap. So you could have your money melted into silver and have your silver transformed into objects. And a lot of people did that. So it had another role than just being a pretty object you could use, but it was also a way of putting your money into objects you could show off with. And in the middle of the 19th century, the relation of this value to the weight was changed, and so little by little that role of silver changed and vanished. Of course, nowadays we have the industries, and you can make objects that are much stronger, that don't blacken like silver is doing, and this together with the fact that the value is not what it the value it's difficult to explain in English. This meaning of silver in terms of money is not doesn't exist anymore. So in the beginning of the 19th century, there were more than 400 silversmiths working in Amsterdam, and it was a very important center. And now I don't know how many, but maybe 20, 30. I wouldn't know, but I don't think it's very important anymore.
I've been told that as the VOC first went out to do their trading with the East, that when they encountered like the Chinese who they wanted to trade with, that the Chinese were really not interested in any of the objects that were brought from Europe. They considered them to be somewhat inferior, and what they really wanted was silver. It was the common basis of trade. Now, was this silver trade in that sense in any way related to the vast working of silver, or changing your silver into money or money into silver, related to the trade that was so significant in the 17th century?
Well, in a way, of course it was. If I understand your question well, the trade brought in huge amounts of money, and the change went very quickly. So all of a sudden, people in Holland, and especially in Amsterdam, because of their trading, became extremely rich, started building all these palazzi on the water side, the canals, and they had to decorate it with art, and especially with silver, because silver is the material to show off your new wealth. So you had all these new rich people who wanted to show their wealth to the world, to each other, but to the world. And so that's this money is always a very the condition for art to emerge. But apart from the fact that money came in, there was another reason that the arts had such a special level, and that's because of the fact that this money worked as a magnet for all a lot of the good artists in Europe, who were not only good and skilled, but also were adventurous and were strong people. So they came to Amsterdam, and most of the silversmiths and the goldsmiths came from countries like Germany, France, even Russia, Sweden. And they all came to Amsterdam, and together they created a whole new style and a level of the arts, like you see in painting as well, in sculpture. Well, in all the arts, in fact, in architecture.
Now, this style that you're referring to, that we're talking about, that was created by Lutma and some of his followers, how would you describe that, and in what way is it significantly different than, say, the classicism that, or the classic art that was actually in vogue at that time?
Well, you are referring to what is called auricular style, kwapstijl in Dutch, and it's a style that is indeed very brutal, anti-classical. It's derived from nature, even from the human body, from anatomy, like the ears, the curves of the ear, the plies of the skin, even the inside of a skull. Like Lutma made a bowl in the form of an open skull. And if you think of Rembrandt, of his painting, The Lesson of Dr. Dijman, which is also a painting of an open body, of a dead corpse of a crook, in which they can see what the hidden world inside a human being. So they were very interested in that. So it's a form of decoration that is derived from nature, and it's interesting in the changing of the centuries. The styles always go back to classical antiquity, because that was the rule. The ideal set of forms was found in the classical antiquity. But of course, artists get bored with these severe rules, and so in all the time, after some years, you see a style that's going against it. For example, the Rococo, the 18th century style, is also very much against this classical antiquity, and later on the Art Nouveau also. Sorry, ik denk dat ik even op moet nemen.
Now, the show itself is called Gold and Silver. How did gold, in the same way, differ from the silver production at that time?
Gold, a flourishing time for gold was the 18th century. The Huguenots, the French refugees, they controlled the whole gold market. And in gold, you see the changing of the fashion, because the whole 18th century is characterized by the changing fashions that came from the court of France. The style of Louis XIV, the 15th, the Rococo, Louis XVI. In art history, that's very important and very interesting to look at these changing fashions. So the tone was set by the French in the 18th century. The goldsmith, coming from France, started to implement these new fashions before the rest did. So this is one of the reasons that gold is in advance, talking about this fashion. some 10, 15 years. Another thing about this gold market was that most of the objects made of gold are accessories to clothing, like snuff boxes and belts, etc. Objects that you have close to the body. And as you know, fashion occurs the first in clothing. So the second part to go with it were these accessories. So the gold is always first in changing fashion. What we found out is that the circle of these French Huguenots had a lot of contact with other circles of French goldsmiths, for example in London. And they even ordered parts of these objects they made in Holland, in Amsterdam. They even ordered parts of it in London. So that you see, for example, the top of an object, the dexel, is from a London goldsmith, even signed, as the rest is made by a goldsmith of Amsterdam. And at first we didn't really understand why, but after doing research, we found letters of these goldsmiths from Amsterdam who were visiting their relatives or their colleagues in London, and so they had a lot of contact. So that's about the gold trade.
Now, there was as you say, the French were more or less the 18th century. In the 19th century, the English took over. And what was the significant difference as the influence, say, of France in the previous generation, now England? How did that differ, and what was the significant change?
Well, what happened was, it's quite funny. It's really about making money. Doing research in the archives of the guild, which was really the police of the gold and silversmith, we found letters of the guild that was giving penalties to two brothers, Dumont, also French, who were shopkeepers. And they started, at the end of the 18th century, they started to import English silver, which was, of course, harming the silversmith from Amsterdam. There were more than 400 silversmiths working at that moment, so it was an important craft. And so they got penalties because they had to pay a lot of money to import it. So it means that the customer in Amsterdam didn't want French-styled silver anymore, but was more interested in English silver. For what reason? So the reaction was that the brothers Dumont and others started to sell Dutch silver in English style. And the English style of that moment was quite simple, with little decoration and smooth surfaces, a geometrical design. And the Dutch did it like the English, but they went further. They went further in its simplicity. And also they invented new functions for the objects, like a coffee filter machine and other kind of objects. Another important thing about these undecorated objects is that the silver could be delivered now in prefabricated plates, which you could fold to geometrical forms, whereas before you had a piece of silver that had to be hammered flat and hammered up. But at that moment, it changed, and you could buy prefab plates. So it means that they started working with models like you do when you make a coat, when you make clothes. You understand what I mean? Mm-hmm. So this is also one of the reasons that the design changed. So it's a combination of facts. But the fact is that the silver from that period is really recognizable by its undecorated forms. And it looks as if it has been made today, or in the period of industrial design. But industrial design wasn't there yet. I mean, there was no industry. It was just starting a little bit in England, but it was just before. So it's a funny combination of facts.
Now, could you tell us how long this exhibit will be on and when the people can come and see it?
It's till the 26th of March, and then it's over, and 80% of the pieces will go back to the storage, and 20% will be seen in the museum as always. But then it will be less eminent than it's now.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today.
It was a pleasure.
So, Ruud, tell me a little about your exhibition here at the Scheepvaart Museum. What exactly is the Scheepvaart in Reclame?
Well, Scheepvaart in Reclame is an exhibition about shipping and advertisements. Well, the goal we have with it is to show that there is a lot of advertisements with maritime themes in it, captains, boats, ships, etc., naval heroes, and we also want to try to show that those themes are connected with Dutch maritime history and culture. And so what we in fact are doing is using advertising as a mirror of Dutch maritime history and culture.
I noticed in the exhibition that you, as you said, you had things about heroes, going back to some of the early Dutch heroes like Piet Hein. Could you tell us a little about the hero element in your exhibition?
Yes, Piet Hein is connected with advertising for the Silver Fleet Savings Scheme. It's a scheme that was made in 1958 by the Dutch government, and they want to make it attractive for young people, so they look for a name for it. So they came with the name Silver Fleet, positive associations with hero, with earning money, etc., etc. So Piet Hein, who in fact captured the Silver Fleet in 1628, was in 1958 the promoter of a saving scheme. And in fact it's very strange because what we can read in the advertising stuff of that time is they call the youngsters of Holland to sign up at the Silver Fleet. But the Silver Fleet is, of course, a Spanish fleet which was captured by Piet Hein. So, in fact, they asked the young people to sign up with the enemy, and the enemy was robbed by Piet Hein. So you lost your saving money.
I also noticed that a lot of this advertising is a bit seductive in its presentation, isn't it?
Of course, it's the essence of those things that it must be seductive. Well, we want to try people to let them buy ships, to use drinks. Drinking and water and shipping is a very popular combination. The reason why so many Dutch admin use maritime themes is, I think, because it's so very profoundly connected with Dutch culture and the experience, the daily experience of people nowadays. Also, because recent research has shown that one of the 10 people in Holland earn a ship longer than 6 meters. That's an awful lot. That's a lot more than, by example, in England or in Germany. So we are still very fond of the water, and everybody wants to have a yacht for his own. The insurance companies and the banking institutions make a lot of advertising for saving schemes and pension schemes. And they show the Dutch people, if you save well, you can, when you are 65, build your own yacht. That's an important theme in those ads.